Hello, dear friends. Hello. Welcome to Spirit Reports of Life After Life by Allan Kardec. We're basing our studies on heaven and hell, the second part of heaven and hell, particularly on the cases, on the case studies, on the real life TV, the real life reports. And we have been on focusing on the happy spirits. Now there's many different categories. Tonight is our last time that we will be focusing on a happy spirit. And we will be seeing, starting next week, that the lives and reports of those who are not happy spirits will be quite different. It will be a very different experience for us. And so far we have been able to learn from the happy spirits what to do in order to guarantee an easier transition for ourselves. And on the contrast, the other spirit reports will show us more of what not to do. So my name is Sunshine Beck, and I'm a co-founder of Beseja Spiritual, founding member of the Beseja Spiritual Healing Center in Sacramento, California. And that center has been in existence for about 10 years, almost 10 years. And I'm the founder of Divine Light Spiritist Group, which is in Nevada City. And we've been meeting for a year and a half. And we're grateful to Kardec Radio that we have this beautiful platform where we can meet internationally, worldwide, to exchange Spiritist teachings, ideas, and to focus on different subjects which are so educational and are nourishing our souls, helping us in our eternal growth. And for that, we're grateful. We need more of that, not less. Right, friends? So tonight, we will be finishing the last case of the happy spirits, and this is Maurice Gontran. We started off with him last week and only did half of his spirit report in his life, and today we will be finishing it off. But before we continue on, finishing off doing the second half of this report, I want to quickly recap what we covered last week. So Maurice was an only child. He passed on very young. He was only 18. He was very talented and studious. And his parents were they were taking it on. They were thinking that by supporting and maybe even pushing their son into the studies, they had precipitated his passing early. And of course, we've learned that that's not the case. But then he was evoked shortly after his passing. By the way, his case you can find if you want to follow along. In Heaven and Hell on page 317. And he reports that his early passing really happened in order to initiate his parents, in particularly his father, experience. He said, God granted my father this misfortune, namely his death, to draw him out of error. So then he continues on to say, and we know that through suffering we have potential, the invitation to draw closer to God. And we are invited to see the bigger picture. And that is what his son was hoping for his father. Then he continues on to talk about the despair that his parents felt and at his passing. And he reports of God and is always punished by a prolongation of the pain, the trial. And we learned along the way that obedience is the surrender of reason, which is something his parents have a hard time doing. And we also learned that resignation is the surrendering of the heart. Now, when we are capable of practicing obedience as well as resignation, titled Health, where Emmanuel teaches us that these sentiments, these feelings, cause a disturbance in our cellular construction, our perispirit. And the longer we indulge in despair and these sentiments, the more our immune system gets weakened. it causes a disruption. And we all know when our immune system gets weakened, we get sick. Because it is the immune system that wards off pathogens. And these are not just pathogens that are acute, but also chronic. So I'm seeing dear friends coming in, and I want to honor you and celebrate your appearance. Karen, I am noticing that my connection has a little bit of a hiccup. So we're hoping that we can cruise through. It is on certain days, particularly Sunday evenings, that there is a little bit of a problem. And I think it's linked to many people maybe being online in the neighborhood. But let's hope for the best. Please bear with me. So despair. So this is not a feeling that we want to nurture and nourish in ourselves. So we looked at that, and then he talked about pain. He said, despair is truly suicide, for it saps the bodily energies. And this is exactly what Emmanuel mirrors to us in chapter 15, Health in Thought and Life. It's a beautiful chapter. Warmly invite you to read it. And then he continues on and says, and those who shorten their days in hopes of more quickly escaping the bitterness of pain will face the cruelest disappointments. So let us pause for a moment, and we touched on pain last week, but I want to pick up on pain again, because pain is such an important subject in our lives. We all suffer from pain, may it be physical, emotional, mental. So pain is a current in our lives. It is a helper. It is something that it is actually probably the most potent agent in our lives on earth through which we learn lessons. Because it is often when life goes really well, we party. We go into the la 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 mode, and we're having a good time, but we're not really facing our stuff and we're not really facing why we're here, namely to transform, to learn, to become better people. So when we look at pain, I want to start off with this beautiful book, After Death by Leon Denis. And we're going to page 137, which is the chapter on trial and death. And he says that pain is the supreme purifier, the instiller of patience, resignation, and austere duty. This sentence alone we could spend a lot of time on, right, friends? But let us repeat it. Pain is the supreme purifier. So let us embrace pain. Pain is the supreme purifier, the instiller of patience, resignation, and austere duty. Pain helps us to become more patient, which is a virtue. Pain helps us to learn resignation. Remember, friends, resignation is the surrender of the heart. It's a beautiful practice when we can truly surrender to the vicissitude towards the incomprehension of others. So it is as long as we are prideful and selfish, there is no space for the practice of charity. And we're learning that pain is the dissolver, helps us to burn down. It's like a furnace that melts away our selfishness and pride. And then he says, when the storm is spent and the soul can calmly face its grief, it discovers that suffering has made it better, made the soul better. And then he says, physical suffering also has its objective. It chemically loosens the bonds that unite the spirit to the flesh. And that is really important for our subject matter, because we are talking about the moment of transition, the moment where our soul separates from our physical form, and then the life, after this life on earth. So physical suffering helps us to loosen our bond to our physical form. It liberates the spirit from the coarse fluids which even after death envelop it, holding it down to the lower regions. And here is a footnote that we read already last week, but we're repeating it again this week because it pertains not only to pain and suffering, but also to Maurice's case, because remember, he died at the age of 18. And it says, this attribute of suffering explains in some cases the brief term of those children who die at a tender age. These souls had already acquired sufficient knowledge and virtue to ascend to higher regions, but were withheld by some remnant of materialism, a remnant that bound them to earth, which stopped their flight to the other side, and so they returned to complete their purification by suffering. Now, remember, friends, Maurice was suffering. He was sick for quite a while before his passing. He was extremely talented. He was very intelligent. So this fits exactly that Léon Denis gives us here in the footnote. And that is most likely, or it's very possible, let's put it this way, it's possible that Maurice was a spirit who only needed to live a short life to release the final bond to materialism, for his soul to be more free, to ascend to higher realms. Isn't that beautiful, friends? It is just so when we open up our vision to the bigger picture, it is so consoling, and it's so helpful, because it's really pain, suffering, the so-called death is something that we're all faced with, and it is something that all causes us all pain. So then he says, death and the reincarnation which follows after a certain interval are the two essential forms of progress. So it is suffering, pain, and our transition to the other side, releasing our physical form. That stands for progress and transformation. There is no losing when we have pain. Then we go on to, we're going to another book by Léon Denis. There's something about Léon Denis that is very poetic, and it is this book. It's called Life and Destiny. He has a way with words that attracts me, so I keep referring to him. So we're going to page 197, and that is in the chapter Sorrow. And again, the invitation for you is to read the whole chapters in both After Death and in this 197. And we're just picking out tiny little bits and pieces. And so he says, it is by duty and by suffering born worthily that we blaze the trail to heaven. Isn't it beautiful, friends? Let us say that again. It is by duty and by suffering born worthily. I'm guessing he's saying with resignation and patience that we blaze the trail to heaven. And then he says we must suffer to grow and to conquer. Acts of sacrifice increase spiritual radiations. So it is through the suffering that we also, during this lifetime, loosen our bond to the material world, and sometimes also to our bodies. And it is through this that we are reaching spiritual radiation. It is through this that we become more lucid, more etheric, more beautiful. And he says, misfortune and anguish are needed to give the soul its richness. I'm repeating because the connection was a little difficult. So misfortune and anguish are needed to give the soul its richness, its moral beauty, and to awaken its sleeping senses. And he says there is a charm, at once tender and serious, in the faces which have been often bathed in tears. Isn't it sweet? They take on an austere beauty, a sort of majesty, impressive yet seductive. Friends, how can we not embrace our pain and our suffering after these beautiful words, and knowing that it will help us to connect with the heavenly energies, with God, with the healing doctors, the spirits on high, with Jesus, our guide and model. It's a beautiful thing. We just need to really remember when we are in pain that this is the truth and not the moment of suffering where we might feel despair, and we know that despair will get us more sick because it suppresses our immune system. So now we're going to continue. We're going to dart into new... Oh, I wanted to do one more thing. I'm just realizing for a moment along the lines of pain, because it's a very important subject. I want to go to the gospel, our beloved gospel, and we're going to page 312. Just a moment here. We're going to page 312, and that is chapter 9. Chapter 9, 312, chapter 9. Which is, of course, faith moves mountain. Because when we're in pain and suffering, what do we need most? Faith, right, friends? If we have faith, all of our suffering becomes less painful or easier to endure. So, consequently, we want to segue into faith for a moment. And it is on page 312 where Allan Kardec tells us faith means the confidence one has in accomplishing something. In the case of suffering, it is the faith, the confidence to know that it will transform us, the confidence to know that it is for our own best, in our own best interest, that we need to feel this pain right now to shape us, to transform us, to allow us to grow. And we know in confidence that this shall pass too. This too shall pass. We know that Chico Xavier had it carved on a sign over his bed. And we know that Mother Mary always said that to those who were in pain and suffering. And so then Allan Kardec continues to say, true faith is always calm. True faith is always calm. It provides the patience. It provides the patience that knows how to wait. And then he says, true faith allies itself with humility. And earlier in Leon Denis, we heard that it is through pain and suffering that our selfishness and pride melt away. And here Allan Kardec sees it from the other perspective, and he says true faith allies itself with humility. Because how can we have faith in God or even recognize that there is a higher being that is guiding us all the time, the whole planet, if we're not humble? Right? Isn't it beautiful how the different teachers, how the different spiritist literature just reiterates the same point of view but from different angles? Very fascinating. And then he says, rational faith, did I go over some? No, rational faith, that which is based on facts and logic, which is the faith that we practice these days in Spiritism, leaves no darkness in its wake. One believes because one is sure, and no one can be sure unless they have understood. So we're not asking blind faith. We are very much following the reasoned faith, the rational faith, which allows us to use our mind, our thinking, our reason to see whether this all makes sense, right? And that's where education comes in. Continual education, opening our minds and our hearts to the bigger picture. So now let us move on. So we stopped at the bottom of page 318, and here Maurice tells us, my dear and kind parents, and I invite you to see the parents as us, you and I, friends, all of us. So the parents that he is addressing here is really he's addressing us because we're learning from him. He's the soul who has already moved on and is pretty wise, and he's teaching us some good lessons. So my dear and kind friends, he says parents, but us, I'm now addressing you. Ever since I left my mortal remains behind, I have never left your side. I was living. Take heart, for I am not dead. Rather, I am more alive than you. Only my body died, but my spirit will live forever. It is free, happy, and without disease, infirmity, and pain. Instead of feeling afflicted, rejoice in knowing that I am in an environment exempt from concerns and anxiety, and where my heart is full of the purest joy without a shadow of trouble. He's painting a very idyllic picture, And this is the picture of a happy spirit, a spirit who completed his trial on this earth, his trials on this earth, and was ready to move on, who is already evolved, quite evolved. And let us remember, he was only 18 when he passed on. And we're invited by this example and all the examples we've studied so far to look at the deaths, let's call them deaths, that we read in the paper or in news reports, to really not despair, but see that even when people are being killed in wars or terrorist attacks, there too is a bigger reason that they are allowed to pass on. So it is an invitation for us to see the sun in these moments. So then Maurice says, do not mourn those who die prematurely. Now this is very important for all of us, right? Do not mourn those who die prematurely. And of course we may add, let us not mourn anyone who passes, right? Because it is a grace that God bestows on them. It is a grace, saving them from the tribulations of earthly life. My existence on earth did not last long this time, because I acquired what I needed to prepare myself for a more elevated mission. If I had lived for many years, do you know what kinds of dangers and seductions I might have been exposed to? Do you know that had I succumbed to them by not being strong enough to resist, it could have been presented for me to delay of centuries? Good point, right? So why do you mourn? What has been to my advantage? Why do we mourn what has been to the person's advantage? The person who passed on and so-called died, it was to their advantage. In a case like this, an inconsolable grief would indicate a disbelief that is only legitimate if one holds to the idea of nothingness. The idea of nothingness is that he is alluding to is the belief that there's only one lifetime. And then when we die, when the body dies, everything dies. There's nothing to go to. That would be a very bleak way, wouldn't it? So let us pause for a moment and let us look at this, what he's saying here a little bit more. For that, we're going to the Gospel, chapter 5, which is on page 114. And Samson, you may remember Samson. He was the first happy spirit that was invoked, and we talked about in the very first meeting of Heaven and Hell. And he was a member of the Parisian Spiritist Society. He was an evolved spirit, and he gave a very interesting account. I'm sure you can go back on Kardec Radio in order to look it up. So it is by him, and the chapter is titled The Loss of Loved Ones, Premature Deaths. And here we learn, when death comes to reap a harvest in your family permanently, taking the youngest before the oldest, you often say, God is not just, since he sacrifices the one who is strong and has a great future while preserving those who have already lived many years full of disappointment, taking those who are useful and leaving behind those who no longer are. He's referring to the older people. And breaking a mother's heart by depriving her of the innocent creature that was her whole joy. Do you guys recognize ourselves, what we may say or think, or other? We probably all know people who say and think exactly this, who particularly mourn the death of a young person instead of seeing the blessing in that. So now we're invited to a different perspective. So Samson continues to say, why do you measure divine justice according to your own? There it is, friends. We're invited to open our scope, our vision, our minds, to not just look very narrow-mindedly, very myopically at a situation and judge these situations with our own limited knowledge, maybe even our own limited legal system on this earth. Do you think the Lord of worlds inflicts you with cruel punishments out of mere caprice? Good question, right? Nothing is done without an intelligent purpose. And no matter what happens, everything has its reason for being. If you were to better scrutinize all the pains that strike you, pain, you would always find in them a divine reason, a regenerating reason, and your miserable self-interests would be a secondary consideration that you would relegate to last place. Isn't it beautiful? What an invitation. What a way of looking at death in a different way. So we're invited to open up our perspective and not judge it on the surface with our limited keyhole perspective on life. We're seeing it as a purpose, as a regeneration. He continues to say, premature death is frequently a great blessing. It's a great blessing that God grants to those who depart. Remember, Maurice said the same thing. Thus preserving them from the miseries of life or the seductions that could have led them to their loss. Isn't it interesting that Sanson is really mirroring what Maurice says, or Maurice is mirroring what Sanson says? So they're both saying that it's not only a blessing because the soul isn't granted the gift to move on, also preventing the soul from potentially making some mistakes that may prolong its path of regeneration. God deemed it useful for those souls not to remain on earth any longer. And that is where our faith needs to kick in. To know, to really truly know, to be humble enough that we know that God granted this situation to the soul and it is perfect for this particular being. And it is important that we're humble enough to recognize that. It is an awful misfortune, he continues to say, you say, for a life so full of hopes to be cut short so soon. What hopes are you talking about? This narrow way of looking at things is always what renders you incapable of rising above matter. And that is what we're invited to do this lifetime around. This is our invitation. We know Spiritism, we know the teachings, and we're invited, we're asked to rise ourselves above matter, which will help us in our life, in the rest of our lives. It will help us with our transition, and it will help us in our life, afterlife, and in a new incarnation. It is the inner transformation that is the key to our success. And then he says, do you know what would have been the fate of that life, which according to you was so full of hopes? We wouldn't have known, right? What do we know? Rejoice instead of complaining when it pleases God to take one of his children from his valley of misery. He's talking about how good it is for them to be able to move on. Another invitation to release selfishness and pride. That is the grief conceived by those who have no faith, who see in death an eternal separation. Again, the invitation to faith. Mothers, you know, your beloved children are close to you. Yes, very close. And remember, friends, Maurice said the same thing. He is very close to his parents. Their fluidic bodies envelop you, so the souls who envelop you. But your unreasonable sorrow afflicts them too, because it denotes a lack of faith and it is revolt against God's will. Friends, and that is exactly what we are here for, to practice faith and to surrender, to practice obedience, which is surrender of our reason, and resignation, surrender of our hearts, therewith aligning our will with God's will, having faith that this is all in perfect order. So now we're going, I am noticing that the connection is a little bit iffy. Every time I see it, I pause. I hope this helps you to not feel you're missing anything. I either pause or repeat myself. So then he says, oh, my good friends, do not mourn those who died prematurely. I think we said that, didn't we? So then he is being asked, was your death painful? Good question. Remember, friends, all the happy spirits had different accounts, but most of them actually reported of the illness, but the suffering diminished as my final moment approached. Then one day I went to sleep without thinking about death, and I had a marvelous dream. I dreamt that I had been healed, that I no longer suffered. I took deep breaths of a balmy and invigorating air. A brilliant light surrounded me, but did not fatigue my sight. I saw my grandfather, who was no longer emaciated or feeble, but youthful and fresh. He held out his arms to me and gathered me close to his heart. A crowd of others, all smiling, came with him and all benevolently and gently welcoming me. Beautiful. I seemed to recognize them, and I felt happy to see them. We exchanged greetings and showed our friendship for one another. Well then, what I had supposed to be a dream was in fact reality, for I was not to awaken from that dream on earth, but in the spirit world. And how magical it is to be released from the vicissitudes of life. And the good news is that we have all the tools at our hand to prepare ourselves, to diligently chisel away on our inner transformation in order to hopefully ease our transition and to perhaps be a happy spirit as well. And these spirit accounts are very powerful because they really teach us the lessons that these spirits went through, and we are so fortunate as to be able to glean from them. So then the question is, then your illness was not the result of excessive studies. Remember, his parents were feeling guilty because they thought it was due to Maurice's excessive studying that he had passed away earlier on in his life. And so this is the question for Maurice to answer it and see whether in fact his passing, his death was linked to, oh no, please don't think it was. The time that I was to spend on earth had been set, and nothing could have kept me there any longer. In its moments of emancipation, my spirit knew this, and it was happy at the idea of its approaching deliverance. However, I didn't fail to take advantage of the time I was there, and now I'm happy for not having wasted it. My serious studying strengthened my soul and increased its knowledge. So his studying strengthened his soul and increased its knowledge. And even though in virtue of my short life among you, I couldn't put it to practical use, I will do so successfully in the future. Why is he saying that? Well, he's saying that because when we invest in our eternal life as a soul, because our soul, the life of our soul, of us, of truly us, is eternal, we will never lose that. As we learn in Thought in Life, not sure what number chapter, maybe 4 or 5, where Emmanuel teaches us it takes 2 wings for us to soar. There is the wing of wisdom and knowledge, which is more the academic knowledge that we accumulate, which is also what Maurice talks about. And there is the other wing, which is love and charity. It is our inner transformation, our moral growth. We need both in order to become elevated spirits, help us with our moral transformation. And what better way as to meet on Kardec Radio to nourish our souls, which we will be taking into our eternal life. And Maurice is talking about that too. He said he didn't waste any time studying because all of this information, even though he wasn't able to use it in this short lifetime, it will be useful in the future. Now, he said early on, the time that I was to spend on earth had been set, and nothing could have kept me there any longer. Let us pause here for a moment, friends. And we're going to pull out the Spirit's book, page 470. Page 470. It is the chapter on the law of freedom. Now, we all know that the third part of the Spirit's book has all the divine laws listed, and Carol Correa so beautifully goes through them in her Gospel at Home. I do always listen to it afterwards, so it's a beautiful study of these very important divine laws. And so the law of freedom has a chapter called fatalism, and we're just going back for a little bit to see. Remember, Maurice said that his time of passing had been set and there was no way he could have stayed longer on earth. So the definition of fatalism on earth is the trials of physical nature are fixed. So they're fatalistic. So they're not something that we can actually, our moral trials and temptations, that's when we practice our free will. That is something that we can actually change. So in other words, let us say if we get diagnosed with cancer, that would be a trial of physical nature and would presumably fall into a predestined situation. But how we respond and how we deal with this challenge, with this trial, then that would be more of a moral, that would be the moral aspect. For this moral aspect of the trial, we have free will. All right, friends? Now, understanding this, we're now going to question 853. Yes, on page 470 in the same chapter. And here Allan Kardec asks, there are persons who escape one mortal danger only to fall into another. They seem unable to escape death. Isn't there fatalism in this? So in other words, the fact that some people fall from one dangerous situation into another, however do not die, is that because death is predestined? It falls under fatalism. And the answer is, fatalism, in the true meaning of the word, applies only to the instant of death. So it is the instant of death, the moment that we all have our expiration date, so to speak. We all have our expiration date, and that is predestined according to the spirits on high. When that moment, that they actually influence the moment of their son's passing, is not correct. They couldn't have done that. This is up to God. It is a predestined moment. Our moment of our death is predestined, and according to the spirits here. And then he says, then whatever may be the danger that threatens us, we will not die if our hour has not come. And the answer is no, you will not die. And you have thousands of examples. But when your hour for departure comes, nothing will save you. God knows beforehand what kind of death will cause your departure. And frequently your spirit also knows it, because it was revealed to it when it made the choice of this or that existence. Interesting, friends, right? So we can really rest assured that, yes, we have, it's the law of preservation that demands from us that we preserve our bodies, that we take good care of it. And Carol Correa has already covered that. At the same time, our moment of departure is already set. Now in question 854, Allan Kardec now asks, from the infallibility of the hour of death, does it follow that the precautions taken to avoid it are useless? So now he's wondering, he's very smart. So of course now he's wondering, well, when do we even have to worry? Because our time is set, so can we be careless, daring? And the answer is no, because the precautions you take are suggested to you in order to avoid the death that could result from the dangers that threaten you. So when we're being supported always, so that we will avoid certain dangers. So again, it is good to be humble and to recognize that when there are moments when we escape a danger and we think we may have made a good move to avoid it, now we know it is the good spirits that support us in that. They are one of them. The good spirits are one of the interesting study. Warmly recommended. And so that concludes our study. Let me see. So Maurice finishes by saying, "Farewell, my dear friend. I'm going to be with my parents in order to prepare them to receive this communication." So Maurice is very loving, is a much wiser spirit than his parents, and he sees that his early passing as an opportunity for his parents, and particularly his father, according to him, to draw closer to open up to the bigger picture, and hopefully receive the message by Maurice that he is in a very good place, that it was a blessing for him to be allowed to move on, and that they had nothing to do with his time of departure, because it is something that is predestined, that is already chosen, co-chosen probably, with our own spirits and with Maurice's spirit. So, dear friends, let us close our eyes for a moment and let us connect with our beloved Mother, Father, God, and our guide and model, our wonderful, wonderful Jesus, who is always with us, helping us to understand and learn, helping us to protect ourselves, helping us to guide us towards the good. And we're also connecting with our own mentor spirits and the healing doctors and spirits on high, the mentors of Kardec Radio, and the mentors of each and every spirit who attended our gathering. And it is with deep gratitude for this opportunity to tune our hearts and minds to each other, to attune ourselves to each other, to learn, to understand, to transform, and to take the invitation for our own inner transformation, so that we may also be a happy spirit one day. And it is with deep gratitude for being able to meet on Kardec Radio and his diligence and dedication. And it is with deep gratitude to the spirits who are allowing us to understand what life after life for them was like within the context of their lifetime on earth, so that we can maximize our lessons to increasingly turn towards the good, to visualize the good, to feel the good, to mold the good with all the resources that we have. And with this, we humbly ask for permission to close tonight's session, and so be it. Thank you, dear friends. I am not seeing... Oh, there's Rita de Cassia. Hi, dear friend. Thank you for joining. Yes, we're connected through the heart. Carol, we all are connected. It is a wonderful way. Yeah, the pain is the supreme purifier. What a beautiful way of putting it. Sylvia Beltran, so nice to see you. Juarez Jr., nice to have you here. God's blessings to all. Carol and Tony, thank you so much for joining. So nice to see you. Amalia Pioltini Zilli, so nice to see you too. As you can tell, I'm not Brazilian, so I have a little bit, probably I'm not saying your names correctly. And then Donna Maria Barbola, as you keep on buffering. Yeah, I know, Donna. It has something to do with my internet connection. I apologize for that. Good night, dear friends, and we will meet again. So 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And next week, we will be embarking on the average spirits. So this should be a different gathering. Good night.